Have you ever wondered why one strain of cannabis smells like a pine forest, maybe, and another one smells completely different, like tropical fruit salad?
Yeah, or why some make you feel relaxed and others, well, maybe a bit more anxious.
Exactly. Today, we're doing a deep dive into your sources to really unpack the complex chemistry behind cannabis sativa. We're going to reveal that it's way more than just THC and CBD.
So much more.
We'll explore how its environment shapes its character, how specific compounds might impact brain health, and the surprising truth about what really drives those unique aromas.
That's right. We're pulling insights from, well, quite a few places. There's a big scientific review on two specific terpenes, pine and linalool, and their potential medical uses.
Okay.
Then a piece on cannabis terroir, how the environment matters.
Right. Terroir, like wine.
Exactly. And an article detailing cannabis flavonoids, plus some really cutting-edge research on, like you said, the true drivers of those distinctive scents, including how some compounds might even reduce anxiety.
So our mission today is really to give you a deeper, more nuanced understanding of this plant. It has such a long history and a pretty complex future, too.
Definitely. And it's full of these unexpected moments, these aha discoveries.
Yeah, I think so, too. So let's start maybe with medicinal cannabis. What do we actually mean by that term?
Okay, so generally when we talk about medicinal cannabis, we mean using cannabis-based products to treat various illnesses.
Yeah.
Pretty straightforward.
Right.
But the crucial thing to grasp is that the cannabis plant isn't just about THC, that's delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol and CBD, cannabidiol. Those are the famous ones.
The headliners, yeah.
Exactly. But the plant actually contains over 500 different chemical constituents.
500. Wow, that's an incredible number. So beyond THC and CBD, what else is in this botanical symphony?
Well, you've got terpenes, which we'll talk a lot about, flavonoids, vitamins, fatty acids, even things like sterols, lignanamides, spiroindins, alkaloids. It's a whole cocktail.
Okay.
And this incredible diversity leads us to this concept called the entourage effect.
Ah, yes, the entourage effect. I've heard that term. What's the core idea there?
The basic idea is that all these compounds might work together, synergistically. They could potentially enhance the therapeutic effects beyond what any single compound could do on its own.
So, like, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Precisely. There are studies, for instance, looking at CBD-rich plant extracts versus purified CBD for conditions like treatment-resistant epilepsy.
Okay.
And sometimes the extracts seem more effective. Patients might need lower doses, report fewer side effects, get greater overall improvement with the whole plant extract.
That makes intuitive sense.
Yeah, though, the evidence is still developing on specific clinical goals, like hitting a 50% seizure reduction. But this complexity, this variation across different cannabis chemovars.
Chemovars, so that's like strains or cultivars.
Exactly, just a more precise term. This complexity isn't just a challenge for scientists. It's actually a massive opportunity. It lets us potentially discover novel, maybe even personalized therapeutics.
Like nature offering up these custom-tailored options. Okay, that makes sense. So, with hundreds of compounds, let's zoom in on terpenes. Most people probably link them straight to cannabis, but they're actually found everywhere in nature, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely everywhere. Terpenes are like the most abundant class of naturally occurring small molecules out there.
Really? More than anything else?
In terms of sheer variety and presence, yeah.
Yeah.
You find them not just in plants, but in animals, fungi, even marine organisms.
Wow.
Think about cholesterol in our bodies, or the bright colors of carotenoids in carrots, or even retinol, which is vital for our vision. Those are all fundamentally terpenes are derived from them.
I had no idea cholesterol was related. So they're really basic building blocks. How do plants like cannabis manage to create such a huge variety of them?
They have these internal chemical factories, metabolic pathways. The two main ones in cannabis are called the MEP pathway. That's methylerythritol phosphate.
Okay, MEP.
And the MEV pathway, mevalonate. And then specific enzymes called terpene syntheses take the basic building blocks from these pathways and assemble them into all the different terpenes we see.
Like little molecular construction workers?
Kind of, yeah. And in the plant itself, these terpenes are crucial. They do everything from attracting pollinators with nice smells to acting as toxins or repellents against bugs and diseases. They're vital for the plant's survival.
And humans, we've clued into this for a long time, right? Using them in traditional medicine.
For millennia. Absolutely. Think about things like tea tree oil, which is antiseptic.
Right.
Or ginkgo biloba. People use that for memory.
Right.
Or curcumin from turmeric. known for anti-inflammatory effects. These are all rich in terpenes or related compounds. And like you said earlier, the last 30, 40 years have seen an explosion in scientific research looking into their medicinal potential.
Okay, this feels like a perfect bridge to this idea of cannabis terroir. You mentioned it earlier. It's a term we usually hear with wine or coffee. How does it apply to cannabis?
Yeah, it's a really cool concept. Cannabis terroir is basically the sum of all the environmental factors, the
Yes.
soil, the climate, the altitude, even the specific way it's grown locally.
Cultivation practices.
Exactly. All those things together shape the plant's unique chemical profile, which in turn influences its flavor, its aroma, and maybe even its effects. It's how the environment leaves its signature on the final product.
Fascinating. So let's break that down. Climate first. How do things like temperature and humidity actually shape the plant?
Oh, hugely significant. For example, warmer climates often push the plant to produce more resin, and that usually means higher THC content.
Okay.
Whereas cooler, wetter places might lead to strains with more CBD, maybe making them more resilient, potentially more calming in their effects.
And humidity.
Humidity affects things like mold resistance, how dense the buds get. Even things like temperature drops at night can trigger the plant to produce more terpenes, making the smell stronger. And of course, sunlight intensity boosts cannabinoid production.
Right. Makes sense. And the soil must be absolutely fundamental, too.
Totally. Soil quality dictates what nutrients the plant can actually absorb. The balance of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium that directly impacts cannabinoid levels. Even the soil pH matters. More acidic soils, for instance, can sometimes boost terpene production. And don't forget the microbes in the soil, the fungi, the bacteria. They help the roots take up nutrients.
So like the volcanic soil in Hawaii you mentioned.
Yeah, that rich soil can really enhance terpene production, giving those Hawaiian strains their characteristic tropical fruity flavors.
Right.
Or contrast that with Oregon, where mineral-dense soil often leads to more earthy, piney notes. The soil speaks through the plant.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
What about altitude? Does growing cannabis way up on a mountain actually change it?
It absolutely can. Higher elevations mean thinner air, lower oxygen, but also more intense UV radiation from the sun.
More UV stress.
Exactly. That stress can actually signal the plant to ramp up THC production as a kind of defense mechanism. It can also lead to more compact plants with really potent resin-rich buds. Plus, you often get bigger temperature swings between day and night at altitude, and that can also enhance terpene production, leading to really distinctive profiles. Think about those hardy, potent strains from Afghanistan, often grown at high elevations.
Right, right. So it's the raw environment, but also how humans interact with it. The cultivation practices matter, too.
Oh, definitely. How you grow it makes a huge difference. Using organic methods like compost and natural pest control tends to really support the soil's health and let that terroir shine through. You often get richer aromas, more terpenes.
And non-organic.
Well, chemical fertilizers might give you bigger yields sometimes, but they could also kind of mute the plant's natural terpene expression. They might overshadow those subtle nuances from the terroir.
It's amazing how localized these effects can be. Are there specific regions that are famous for their unique cannabis terroir, like wine regions?
Yeah, definitely. Humboldt County in California is a classic example, known for earthy, pungent, really potent strains, partly thanks to its climate and soil. Oregon, again, often has balanced earthy profiles. Jamaica, with its warm weather, you get those tropical fruity strains, often with a more mellow, uplifting kind of feel.
Right.
Afghanistan, we mentioned hardy, resinous, often very relaxing strains from those high altitudes. And Colombia, another tropical climate, often produces energetic, citrusy strains. Each region's terroir really crafts a kind of signature experience.
That paints such a clear picture. So terroir shapes the whole plant, including the terpenes. And you mentioned earlier, specific terpenes have potential health benefits, especially for the brain. Let's dive into two you highlighted, pine and linalool. Starting with pine, what's the story there?
Okay, pine. As the name suggests, it smells like pine, but also earthy, woody, resinous. It's actually one of the most abundant terpenes in all of nature.
Not just cannabis, then.
No, found in pine trees, obviously, but also rosemary, lavender, frankincense, lots of plants. It comes in two main forms, or isomers, alpha pine and beta pine.
Okay.
And
What makes it interesting biologically?
a key thing is that it seems able to cross the blood-brain barrier.
Ah, so it can get into the brain directly.
Potentially, yes. That opens the door for it to interact directly with brain cells and influence neurological processes. It's also absorbed well and metabolized pretty quickly by the body.
And what does the research suggest it might do in the brain or body?
Well, most of the research is preclinical, meaning in lab settings or animal models. mostly rodents, but it's shown some really promising things.
Like what?
Strong anti-inflammatory and antioxidant activity. It seems to protect cells against oxidative stress and reduce markers of inflammation.
Which is relevant for lots of things.
Exactly. Particularly neuroprotection.
Hmm.
In models of stroke or ischemia, lack of blood flow, pine has been shown to reduce the size of the damaged brain area, the infarct size, and help improve neurological recovery afterwards. It also showed some potential in reducing seizure duration in some models.
Wow. Okay. So, brain protection. Anything else? Pain relief.
Yes, analgesic effects too. It's shown promise in models of inflammatory pain, neuropathic pain that's nerve pain, and even migraine pain.
How does it compare to existing drugs?
In some of these preclinical studies, its effectiveness was comparable to drugs like indomethacin, which is an anti-inflammatory, or gabapentin for nerve pain. And interestingly, in some pain models, its effects lasted longer than morphine.
Longer than morphine. That's pretty remarkable for a natural compound. What about mood or thinking? Cognition?
Yeah, there's potential there too. Betapine specifically showed antidepressant and anti-anxiety effects in rodent models. This might be linked to increasing levels of BDNF brain-derived neurotrophic factor important for neuron health, and maybe dopamine synthesis in the hippocampus, a key brain region for mood and memory.
Better than standard antidepressants in some cases.
One study actually found betapine had significantly higher antidepressant effects than imipramine, which is a traditional antidepressant drug.
Okay. And cognition. Memory.
It seemed to improve memory impairment in some mouse models. And in fruit flies, interestingly, it helped reduce the neurotoxicity caused by beta amyloid, which is linked to Alzheimer's disease. The thinking is it might boost acetylcholine, a key neurotransmitter for memory.
And sleep.
Also potentially helpful there. It seemed to prolong non-REM sleep, the deeper stage, and reduce the time it took for mice to fall asleep, likely by interacting with GABA receptors, which are involved in relaxation.
So pine seems like a real multitasker. Lots of potential, but mostly preclinical so far.
Exactly. Promising preclinical evidence, but we definitely need robust human trials to confirm these effects and figure out the right doses.
Got it. Now, what about linalool? Where does that fit in?
Linalool is another really interesting one. It's got more of a floral, fresh, maybe slightly woody scent. I think lavender linalool is a major component of lavender oil.
Ah, lavender. Okay. Makes sense for relaxation.
Precisely. It's also found in sweet basil and certain cannabis strains, like purple kush sometimes. Like pine, it's generally considered safe, non-toxic, and it can be absorbed through ingestion, inhalation, even through the skin. It might even help wounds heal faster.
And its potential brain benefits. How does it work?
Its mechanisms seem a bit different from pine. It interacts with various neurotransmitter systems. For example, it can act as an antagonist at NMDA receptors, which are involved in learning and memory, and also 5-HT3 receptors, part of the serotonin system. It also seems to bind to the serotonin transporter, SERT.
So, affecting serotonin pathways.
Yes, among others. And again, preclinical studies show significant neuroprotective, anti-inflammatory, and antioxidant effects. It seems to protect brain cells against various kinds of stress and dampen down those inflammatory pathways.
In what kinds of models?
Similar areas to pine, actually models of Alzheimer's disease, stroke, ischemia, even systemic inflammation.
Okay. And cognitive effects. Memory, learning.
There's some compelling stuff there, especially from Alzheimer's models in aged mice. Linalool seemed to improve learning and memory, reduce anxiety-like behaviors, and importantly, it actually reduced the amount of amyloid plaques and tangles the hallmarks of Alzheimer's and cut down on neuroinflammation in the brain.
Wow, actually reducing the physical markers.
In those mouse models, yes. It also helped improve neurological scores and spatial memory after simulated strokes.
That's very promising. What about mood, especially anxiety, given the lavender connection?
Yeah, this is where linalool really seems to stand out. It consistently shows anxiolytic, anxiety-reducing effects in various animal models.
Comparable to standard drugs.
Often, yes. Comparable to medications like diazepam, but frequently without causing the sedation or motor impairment that can come with those drugs.
That's a huge potential advantage.
Absolutely. And it's not just mice. They've even seen anti-anxiety effects in honeybees and horses.
Honeybees. Seriously?
Seriously, which suggests it might be tapping into some pretty fundamental biological pathways related to stress or anxiety.
That's wild. Is there any human evidence for linalool's effects?
Yes, there is, although it's still somewhat limited compared to the animal work. But there was a network meta-analysis that pools data from multiple studies looking at lavender oil capsules, which are naturally rich in linalool. And it found these capsules significantly reduced anxiety scores on a standard scale, the Hamilton Anxiety Scale. The effect size was comparable to paroxetine, a common antidepressant anti-anxiety drug, but the lavender oil had fewer side effects, like fatigue.
Comparable to an SSRI with fewer side effects, that's significant.
It is. Another study used petitgrain oil, which also contains linalool, and found it improved task performance, reduced self-reported anxiety, and boosted mood in participants.
Okay, so the human evidence, while maybe early, seems to align with the preclinical findings.
It does. It suggests linalool, particularly perhaps as delivered in things like lavender oil, has real potential as an anxiolytic. But of course, more research is needed on mechanisms, long-term safety, optimal dosing, and how the effects might vary depending on the specific plant source and the mix of other compounds present.
Right, the entourage effect again. It's truly amazing, though, how these individual compounds, these terpenes like pine and linalool, seem to offer so much potential. Now, with all this focus on terpenes and their effects, you'd naturally assume they're also the main reason cannabis smells the way it does, right?
That's what almost everyone thinks.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's what the industry focuses on heavily.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Maybe grab onto something. Despite that popular belief, recent research strongly suggests that the dominant terpenes, the ones usually listed on products like myrcene, limon, caryophyllene, pine, linalool, they are not the primary drivers of the unique specific aromas of cannabis.
It's a bit of a bombshell, isn't it? The research shows that you can have cannabis varieties with totally different smells, one scumpy, one fruity,
Yeah.
but their dominant terpene profiles can look remarkably similar on paper.
So the main terpenes aren't telling the whole smell story.
Not the specific smell story, no.
Mm.
In fact, the total amount of volatile compounds, which are mostly those dominant terpenes, doesn't even seem to correlate well with how exotic or unique the aroma is perceived to be.
Okay, my mind is slightly blown. So if it's not these well-known terpenes defining those really distinct exotic cannabis aromas, what is? What are the true architects of these unique scents? This is fascinating.
The true architects, it turns out, are often minor compounds, many of which aren't even terpenes. They're now often being called flavorants.
Flavorants.
These are present in much, much lower concentrations than the dominant terpenes. But, and this is key, they have a disproportionately large impact on the actual odor we perceive. They punch way above their weight class, smell-wise.
How did researchers figure this out?
They use some pretty advanced analytical chemistry techniques,
Yeah.
often on highly concentrated extracts like ice hash rosin,
Why that specific extract?
because making it involves water, ice, and pressure, not solvents. So it does a better job of preserving these really volatile, delicate aroma compounds that might get lost in other extraction methods.
Got it. Preserve the delicate stuff.
Exactly. And then they combine that chemical analysis with extensive sensory panel testing, basically, having trained people smell the samples and describe them, even giving an exotic score based on things like sweetness or fruitiness.
And they found a link.
A strong link. There was a significant correlation between the relative amount of these minor flavorants and how high that exotic score was. More flavorants generally meant a more unique, fruity, or sweet aroma profile.
So these are the unsung heroes of cannabis aroma. Can you give us some examples? What are these flavorants and what do they smell like?
Absolutely. One really exciting group is a newly identified class called tropical volatile sulfur compounds, or VSCs.
Sulfur compounds. Doesn't sulfur usually smell bad?
Sometimes, yes, like skunk spray involves sulfur compounds. But in low concentrations, certain VSCs can smell incredibly fruity and tropical. Think passion fruit, grapefruit, citrusy notes, sometimes with just a hint of that sulfur complexity underneath.
Oh, wow. Okay. Where else do you find these?
In actual tropical fruits like passion fruit and grapefruit, but also in things like Sauvignon Blanc grapes and some varieties of hops used in beer. Specific examples in cannabis include compounds like 3-mercaptohexanol, that's a big passion fruit note, and 3-mercaptohexylacetate.
And finding these can even help identify strains correctly.
Potentially, yeah. The researchers noted finding these VSCs in samples labeled as Gorilla Glue, which isn't typically known for a tropical profile, suggesting possible mislabeling based on aroma chemistry.
Okay, so VSCs for tropical notes. What about those more savory, funky, or even chemical smells some strains have, like GMO or garlic cookies?
Right, for those smells, a different group seems important. Indole derivatives.
Indole.
Yeah. Indole itself is found in lots of varieties and gives a kind of general floral, maybe slightly mothball-like scent. But another one, skatole, that's 3-methylindole, seems to strongly correlate with those savory chemical aromas.
Skatole, I feel like I've heard that name. Isn't it associated with Less pleasant smells?
It is. At high concentrations, scadol is known for a distinct fecal odor. However, in lower amounts, it contributes to this complex, pungent, savory profile in cannabis. Interestingly, it's also used in tiny, tiny traces in some perfumes to add complexity.
Perfumers use scadol. Wild.
Yeah, and its strong, pungent aroma in cannabis can actually overpower some of the other sweeter or fruitier compounds that might also be present.
Okay, so VSCs for tropical, indole escatol for savory chemical, any other important flavorant groups?
Yes, definitely. There's a family of esters called senesioids. Esters are often fruity-smelling compounds. Senesioids seem to contribute fruity base notes, kind of like banana or green apple, especially in those really high exotic-smelling varietals.
Blisters like in artificial fruit flavoring.
Similar types of molecules, yeah. And beyond senesioids, there are over 30 other esters identified in cannabis that add to the sweet and fruity complexity, things like ethyl hexanote for an apple note, or N-propyl hexanote for blackberry, or pineapple hints.
So many esters.
And then there's some structurally unique compounds that seem really important for specific profiles. For example, anthranolytes, like methyl-anthranoate, give a distinct grape-like aroma, like Concord grapes, found in very sweet exotic types.
Grape smells. Yeah.
Then vinyl compounds these give milder, sweet, almost honey-like notes. And interestingly, these were only found in very new, modern, high exotic strains, suggesting they might be a kind of chemical fingerprint for recent breeding efforts.
Like a marker for new genetics.
Potentially. And one more really specific one, 6-amylopyrrone. It's a type of compound called a lactone, and it gives a creamy, coconut-like aroma, also found exclusively in those high exotic varieties.
Coconut. Okay, so this completely changes how we should think about cannabis aroma. What's the takeaway?
The big takeaway is, when you smell a really distinct cannabis variety, it's often the subtle interplay of these minor flavors, the VSCs, the indoles, the esters, these unique compounds, that are truly defining that specific character, much more so than just the levels of the dominant terpenes like myrcene or pine.
So we should be looking beyond just the terpene percentages.
Absolutely. This really opens the door to classifying and maybe even breeding cannabis based on its actual aroma chemistry, focusing on these impact compounds rather than just the bulk terpenes. It gives us a much more accurate picture of what makes each strain smell unique.
That is a truly mind-blowing shift in understanding. Okay, let's connect this back to the effects side. Even if terpenes aren't the main aroma drivers, they clearly still play vital roles in how cannabis affects us, right?
Yeah.
That entourage effect idea.
Exactly. The aroma story doesn't negate the biological effects of terpenes.
So let's revisit limon. We know it smells citrusy, but what did that recent study find about its specific role in the entourage effect, particularly concerning anxiety?
Right, limon. It's abundant, found in citrus peels. This recent study, which was funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, had a really interesting finding. It showed that when limon was given along with THC, it specifically seemed to reduce the anxiety that THC can sometimes cause.
Reduce the anxiety from THC.
Yes, specifically feelings participants described as anxious, nervous, or paranoid after taking THC. Adding limon seemed to lessen those specific negative feelings.
That's a really important nuance. So limon didn't just make people generally less anxious, it specifically counteracted the THC-induced anxiety.
That's what the study suggests. Critically, limon alone didn't reduce anxiety in the participants. And importantly, adding limon didn't seem to change the other effects of THC, like the high or cognitive effects or physiological changes like heart rate. It just targeted that anxiety component.
So it's a selective interaction. That could be huge for making THC more useful therapeutically, right? If you could get the benefits without as much risk of paranoia or anxiety.
Exactly. It makes THC potentially more tolerable and maybe more effective for certain people or conditions.
Does this connect with any sort of folk wisdom or historical uses?
It actually does, which is really neat. There's this traditional anecdotal advice about using lemon or other citrus juices which are high in limon as a remedy if someone feels too high or anxious from cannabis.
Like chewing on a lemon peel or something.
Kind of like that, yeah. So this modern scientific finding seems to provide some validation for that old folk remedy. It raises big questions, like you said. How can we leverage these specific compound interactions to make cannabis safer and more effective, whether for medicine or recreation?
But there are caveats, right? This was a lab study.
Definitely. It's important to remember this study used pure, isolated THC and pure limon. Real-world cannabis products are whole plant extracts with dozens, even hundreds of compounds. Replicating these exact effects and ratios consistently in actual products is still a major challenge,
Yeah,
but it points the way.
it really does. Wow, we have covered a ton of ground today. We've really taken that deep dive, haven't we?
We certainly have.
From understanding that cannabis is this complex chemical factory way beyond just THC and CBD.
Right, exploring how terroir, the soil, the climate, the altitude shapes its fundamental characteristics.
To uncovering the specific potential of terpenes like pine and linalool for things like brain health, mood, and maybe even pain.
Based on that growing body of preclinical and early clinical evidence.
And then that huge surprise, learning that it's often these minor flavorant compounds, not the famous terpenes, that are truly crafting those unique exotic cannabis aromas.
Yeah, the VSCs, the esters, the indoles,
Yeah.
that whole hidden layer of scent chemistry.
And finally, seeing a concrete example of the entourage effect with limon potentially reducing THC-specific anxiety, it really is a chemical symphony.
It absolutely is. And I think this shift in understanding, looking at terroir, flavor, and specific terpene interactions, it moves us closer to a future where maybe cannabis can be, optimized. Optimized through specific growing techniques that enhance terroir, or through breeding programs focused on these flavorants and minor cannabinoids, or creating products with precise ratios to achieve specific therapeutic outcomes or desired experiences, moving beyond just high THC or CBD percentages.
Towards a more personalized, nuanced approach.
Exactly. Tailored to the individual's needs or preferences based on this deeper chemical understanding.
That's a really exciting prospect. It leaves me thinking. Imagine the potential still hidden in the flavors and fragrances of plants all around us. If cannabis holds this much complexity, what other natural compounds in other plants might be waiting to be discovered, waiting to unlock new benefits for our health and well-being? Like pine and linalool, like these flavorants. What else is out there?
That's the big question, isn't it? Nature's pharmacy is vast,
Yeah.
and we're likely just scratching the surface.